So you all had 3 points of inquiry on the table for your breakout rooms. First one being, what is the thesis and the analysis of the reading? Two, what was African American male theory's critique of critical race theory? And then finally, what stood out to you most about African American male theory, and what questions do you have? Who would like to share?
I can go first.
Okay, go ahead, Mom.
All right. So regarding the first question, the thesis, I would say that, so the passage was basically like saying about two theories, CRT and AAMT. Um, so the CRT is mostly, as the passage says, that it normally deals with racism and oppression, but where AAMT is more like they're like systems, microsystem, mesosystem, exosystems. These are like different systems where it adds dimension to the examination or analysis of African American men. Uh, so their beliefs and perception and how they react to different environments. So this is more like the thesis of the passage. So what is AMT critique of CRT? I would say, yeah, AMT has more, uh, I would say, like lenses or to observe what's going on in the African American manhood, their communities, and compared to CRT. Uh, and what stood out, uh, the thing uh, like let's say there's a biological experiment where there is a there's something tested. There's always a control experiment where there's a control environment. So I would say CRT considers that like control environment where race and oppression are the controls. But there's this thing without the control, where, like, in simple words, I would say, like, if the racism and oppression was not there, how would African American men will be today? Like, because normally when we think of them, we always take into account these things. So that really stood out. That point of view, that dimension stood out for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. Great call out. Let's get two more and we'll move on. Who else wants to share? So you could volunteer. I could call on you. It's up to y'all.
Yeah, hello.
Yep.
So I feel like I think it says right there. I need to get the page, but what I read was that black males, they were not being considered. They'll be, I think, the fifth or the fourth, I think, and they will not be considered. They will not prioritize them. As always, like white males will be the priority, right? And I feel like I had a question, like, what if white males were the ones going through slavery back then, right? What that's what I asked my group, but everybody was like, yeah, it would have been a different a role. We would have viewed things differently in life today, right? And how about the critique? I feel like it gives black males like a different like what are you good at? For example, some are strong, some are good in this. Your work task is different from others. So, and then I learned what stood out the most is that most males know that they're intelligent, but they don't want to put them in that way. You know, that's what I think.
Okay, so Santiago, what you're mentioning is John Ogbu's theory that African American males were rejecting educational achievement because they felt that to do so would to be acted white. I'm going to nuance that a little bit as we get further into the conversation, into my notes, excuse me. Also, y'all do know that the first people enslaved in this country were white folks, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, just throwing that out
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Bet. Let's get one more and we'll move on.
Thank you.
I'll go.
Thank you, Brandon.
Um, as far as the reading, I thought it was pretty interesting about AAMT. It was a way for them to learn and understand their history. I shared in our group when we did our breakout room that I had a professor at LACC that it was more of when he was teaching this course, he was kind of insulting African American males and more African American people as a whole. And I found it that the messenger was necessarily something that was put off to me instead of the message that he was trying to send. And so I thought that was huge, especially when we're going to this reading and learning about this. Is like sometimes it's the messenger, not necessarily the message, and how that message is perceived or received by, the target audience.
Brandon, that's really profound because in Group A's conversation on Monday, like 3 other people echoed those same sentiments as to where they had educators, teachers who were thinking that they were doing the right thing, right? And one student gave an example of they had a teacher who was like having them do these really progressive critical race theory practices and readings. And how they would do is like it was a critical race reading of Dr. Seuss, right? So what she was saying is, yeah, she was progressive in her trying to approach it from a critical race theory perspective, but she was complicit in deficit model thinkings because she gave us Dr. Seuss to read. Like our intellectual intelligence is only able to digest things at a level of grammar school, right? So, and then she says later on in the chat that, this was a white teacher, right? And although her intentions may have been well, the way that she went about it really devalued the intention that she was trying to put behind the assignment and making it be, critically race appropriate. So I agree that the messenger is important, right? And it has to, because oftentimes what happens, right, you question the authenticity of the messenger, right? And you want to make sure that they're doing this from a space that's pure, right? And oftentimes that be not the case. Okay, so let me, for the sake of, yes, Lucia saying there's a bias. There's these implicit biases at play. And then also this idea of deficit model thinking, right? Like just thinking that certain segments of the population can only achieve minimal educational academic success. All right. So this reading, like the majority of our readings this semester, is coming from the chair of the Pan-African Studies Department, him and his brother, Dr. Nana Lawson Bush and Edward Bush. And if you know me, right, I'm always interested in how articles, how chapters, how books start, right? Reason being, they lay out for you very clearly 9 times out of 10 their aims, their objectives, and what they're trying to do or why they're doing what they want to do. So this one says that there's no uniform theory has emerged as a foundation and frame that explains the lives of African boys and men, right? So this is what they're seeking to do, is to fill this gap, the theoretical and frame gap that exists in the academy, right? And then they very explicitly state what their aspirations are. He says, we aspire for a more dynamical lens and thereby borrow liberally from ecological systems theory, which allows for more fluid interactions and juxtapositions of abstract and concrete concepts, environments, time periods, and other phenomena. And this is in response to the work of critical race theory, right? They say that critical race theory is very myopic in the way that they're able to assess the life experiences of Black men and boys, because from a critical race theory perspective, all those experiences are impacted by race and racism, right? Clearly state the aims of the text, right? Thus, our aim is to A, summarize developments in African American male studies, B, discuss the problematics of critical race theory and other attempts at theorizing the lives of African American boys and men, and C, building on aspects of ecological systems theory, provide some basic tenets to help structure and construct a dialogue towards African American male development, positions, and practice. So this is what they seek to do through the article. Then they move through the major contributions to men's studies, or to the study of men, right? And they said the first major contribution was the women's movement, The second major contributions was gay liberations movement. The third contribution was the men's movement, right? And they said there's two or three authors who situate these three movements as the major contributors, right? And then they add on another one, the men's movement, and then the majority movement. Honestly, I don't know what the majority movement is. But the authors themselves, they assert three more movements, right? And those are the Black Power and Civil Rights Movement, African American Male Studies, and African Centered Movement, and then finally hip hop as another movement that seeks to investigate African American male and boys' experiences. Then they go into this notion of how African boys and men define manhood and masculinity, right? And they say that it's vastly different from how the dominant culture seeks to define masculinity and manhood. African American males' definition of manhood and masculinity clustered around self-determination, accountability, family pride, spirituality, humanism, and they recognize the duality or the interrelationships of masculine and feminine experiences in both men and women. So this part right here is very important, right? So they're saying one of the things that's vastly different from the way that the dominant culture recognizes manhood and masculinity, Black men and boys, when they view their masculinity, they recognize that there's both masculine and feminine experiences within the male body and within the woman's body, right? So that duality is at play within both sexes, if you will. So again, vastly different from the way that the Western world looks at ideas of masculinity and manhood. Now we kind of get to more, so yes, there's a critique of critical race theory, but then we kind of centralize the critique on two scholars, right? Fordham and Agbu. Now, John Agbu was a Nigerian-born sociologist who did a lot of work in the Oakland school district, and he researched Black boys' experiences within these school districts, right? And one of the articles, he situates this notion or this idea of Black boys acting cool as a response to oppressive forces within the school system, right? But Bush critiqued this claim, stating that through their extensive travels throughout Africa, right, through their extensive involvement with young Black men, they affirm that Black boys and Black men are going to present this coolness regardless of systems of oppression, right? This cool posture that's struck within African boys and men is something that's innate within all African boys and men, and that would be present regardless if there was racism or not, right? Then they go into the work of Du Bois. And this claim that Du Bois makes that there's a distinct nexus between Africa and America. And he's referring to Africans on the continent of Africa and Africans here in the Americas, right? So there's a nexus between those two groups, which though broken and perverted, is nevertheless not to be neglected by the careful student, right? So if you're really studying carefully the life experiences of African boys and men throughout the diaspora, right, you cannot effectively do that study by leaving Africa out of that conversation, right? If you're going to do serious work around African boys and African men, you have to engage Africa at some capacity, right? And this is coming from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was arguably one of the greatest intellectuals and scholars, not only on this planet, right, but within the Black intellectual tradition. Then this idea of distinctions, right? The authors claim that distinctions are necessary across areas of discipline to create specialized programs, pedagogies, and curricula in education, right? And to me, when I read this, I think about, I don't know if y'all been in conversations with certain folks and they'd be like, well, I don't see race, right? We're all humans. We're all part of the human being. We're all part of the human race. That's the only race that I see, right? So what that claim does, it erases the distinctions that certain groups have, right? If you pay attention to how I use terms, I use the term people of culture opposed to people of color, right? Because the term people of culture speaks to those cultural specificities within each group, right? These distinctions. when you say you don't see people's color, what you're implicitly saying is all I've trained my mind to see is whiteness, right? And again, there's a difference between people who occupy white bodies and this idea and this notion of whiteness as a concept, right? So when you make the claim that I don't see color, I've trained my mind, I've trained my ideological framework to only recognize, validate the idea and the notions of whiteness, okay? So the authors claim like, no, we need to situate ourselves in these distinctions, right? Because Roxana, you have a distinct cultural background and heritage. Santiago, you have a distinct cultural background and heritage. Jennifer, you have a distinct cultural background and heritage. Brandon and Tanai, they have distinct cultural backgrounds and heritage, right? So we need to have pedagogies, forms of educational engagement, right? We need to have programs and disciplines that speak to each individual's specified cultural background, right? For me, this becomes extremely important because my dissertation work is to develop a Pan-African pedagogy, right? A pedagogy that speaks specifically to the African cultural experience, no matter where you are on the globe. So these distinctions become very important. The authors themselves, right? They assert that the study of African American boys and men must also be anchored in Africa. So echoing the words of Du Bois, right? Yeah. I'm just looking at the chat. Brandon says, I always ask if they're blind after those type of statements, right? So how do you fucking not see the color? You must be colorblind. I rock with you on that one. So then they move to this idea, this notion of resilience theory. And for me, resilience theory is a direct response, encounter, and critique of deficit model approaches, right? And deficit model approach is can be found in the example that I gave from the student in group A who said that, you know, she tried to do critical race theory work, but she gave us Dr. Seuss to read, right? So instead of giving them Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, right, which is a culturally responsive text, she gave them Dr. Seuss in a culturally responsive lens, right? So in other words, I don't think you all have the intellectual ability to engage high theory like texts like these, so I'm going to give you nursery rhymes, right? This is this notion of deficit model. So I'm going to think of the lowest academic achievement, and that's the only thing that you all could achieve as people of culture, right? So in response to that is this notion called resilience theory. And resilience theory is concerned with and addresses the ability, capacity, and power that people or systems exhibit that allow them to rise above adversity, right? So how do African people overcome the system of enslavement, right? How do African people deal with microaggressions in the workplace, right? These are these notions of resilience. And then going back to the work of John Ogbu, right? And he says that, you know, another one of his research found that African boys have a defiant relationship to school, right? To education. And they this is Ogbu talking, they relate educational success with acting white, right? And what the authors, Bush and Bush, argue is that what Ogbu has done is he's conflated this notion of schooling and this notion of education into one idea, right? And this is why he has a misunderstanding as to how African boys are navigating their experiences through the school system, right? So let's talk about how the authors define schooling and how they define education, and let's be attentive to the distinctions between the two. So schooling is the process used to maintain and continue asymmetrical power relations, right? So schooling is going to maintain the people who are currently in power remaining in power, right? They're going to keep that process intact. This is what schooling does, right? Education is the process that should make people more capable of manifesting who they are as defined by their cultural and community norms, right? So education should allow you to come into your fullest sense of yourself as defined by your community and defined by your culture, right? I would add education is intended to bring out the divine within you, right? So that what places you highest to the creator, that what places you closest to the most high, that what places you closest in proximity to God. That's that divine within you. Education, in my understanding, should bring out that divinity, right? But this separation and this distinction between education and schooling is very important, because what what Bush is critiquing Agbu of doing is making education and schooling the same thing, right? And what the author is arguing is that no, black boys aren't having a adverse response to education. Black students love education, right? Black people historically love education. They risk having their hands and limbs cut off to educate themselves, right? So education is not the issue. Schooling is the problem. A schooling system that seeks to keep them subjugated in positions of powerlessness, and it seeks to keep certain people in positions of power. This is what black students are pushing back against, right? And I can think back to my K through 12 experience. I graduated with a 1.7 GPA, right? I'm currently in a Ph.D. program. So again, schooling I had an issue with, right? What I was learning in that K through 12 classroom did not resonate with me, so I would literally ditch class. I would go to the school's library and I would look up books on Marcus Garvey. I would look up books on Africa, and I would educate myself, right? So even for me, I had no problem with education, but I just couldn't get down with schooling. So these distinctions become very important, right? If you think back to last week, and I told you all, I'm not really concerned with your grades, right? You'll get your grade. That grade is part of schooling. That grading is part of maintaining these social dynamics of power, right? I'm more interested in educating you, tapping into that divine within you. So my pedagogy is also steeped within this distinction between education and schooling. All right. We'll put a pin in my notes and we'll transition to our fishbowl. Remember, you have to do 2 fishbowls per semester. You could talk about my notes. You could talk about what was discussed in your breakout room. You could quite literally read your journal verbatim. That's all okay. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for a fishbowl?
I'll go for it.
Okay, Mohammed.
I'll go after.
I'm sorry, who said that? I missed this.
Me?
Jennifer? Okay, thank you, Jennifer. So we got Mohammed and Jennifer. Can we get one more?
I can go.
Was that Roxana? No.
Someone else went. They could go.
Are you sure you can go? It's okay. I can try.
It's all yours.
I mean, we can do 4 if y'all want, but I got Alexandra for sure. So we got Mohammed, Jennifer, Alexandra.
All right. So I really go along with your thought that education and schooling are like 2 different things, because I belong to from the Indian subcontinent. So some of our greatest minds were actually not going to school. They were educating themselves, and they wrote papers to the English schools abroad, and they got accepted. So yeah, of course, I completely agree that when you go to schooling, there will be factors like if you have enough finances or if you have the circumstances. But when it comes to education, it's just freedom, and like you can apply your own mind framework to this gaining of knowledge. I agree with that. Regarding the passage, yes. It's my feeling that before, like I normally I used to think that the African American Black concept is very much related to the racial and oppression issues, but this passage opened my eyes into analyzing the context with different theories like the resilience theory or the ecological I don't remember the ecological strategy theory. I don't exactly
Ecological
remember.
systems theory.
Systems theory. So yeah, I really appreciate it because this actually added dimensions to my understanding of the context. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think it's a very good point, right? Not strictly looking through the lens of racial domination to analyze African people's experiences. Great call out.
Right.
Whoever's next.
just something I found like interesting while reading this was about the whole like movement and how like the whole hip hop movement had such an impact. Obviously, we all know that even today. Like it mentions how it was like put into perspective, it was only on like 35 years ago, which is not that long ago. And having the different outcomes obviously we have, and even today we even see that with music, still to this very day. I mean, I think it's gonna go on forward.
Yeah, the role of hip hop in defining what's masculine, defining what's manhood. Great call out. Alexandra?
Just wanting to add something more to the discussion questions between the question 2 and question 3 regarding the African American male theory, how it criticizes the critical race theory, because the way I understood it from the article, African American theory is a theory that it's out there, it's been suggested, uh, a theory that would focus directly to African American male in Africa and as a whole, not only just African American men, obviously here in the United States or other country besides Africa, and how critical race theory, in a way, it's not, because let's say I've taken other classes that also touch upon critical race theory, but in that class they use critical race theory, as this is the only theory that can be out there that you can apply to any other races. And just reading about African American race, male theory, opened my eyes as to how it critical race theory is not the only theory out there that can be created, but since it's the one that most scholars use when it comes to trying to understand certain groups, um, it could create a an idea of like racism or being biased towards certain racial groups, since it could enlarge these like the stereotypes that some groups go through. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. It was a really good fishbowl. If we kind of stay with this conversation we're having around critical race theory, right? And if we are to apply this conversation around critical race theory, but apply it to what's going on in our world today, right? And right now, critical race theory is a very hot button topic issue, right? I think we talked about how they're trying to ban critical race theories from being taught in certain school systems. I know Texas and Florida have already effectively banned critical race theory from being taught in schools. But from what this article is arguing, right, it's saying that critical race theory is not the most comprehensive theory to apply to the life experiences of African boys and men, right? And if this is the case, is there, how much are we losing by critical race theory being banned from schools, right? So if we are to take the article's argument that critical race theory is myopic in its attempts to deal with Black people's lived experiences, right? Are we really missing out on a lot by having this theory removed from the school system? Which I think, not rhetorical.
I think to an extent we do, because then it kind of limits us to celebrating like Black History Month that one time a year versus actually learning about everything as a whole. So even if it is myopic, I think we still would get a little more information out of it. So I possibly.
Yeah. And I think also, Brandon, if you think about it, right, depending on how Black History Month is dealt with, that may be banned also, right? Because that
Right.
could fall under critical race theory as well. Anyone
Exactly.
agree or disagree with Brandon?
I agree. I think when it comes to learning, continuing the education of the history of African people, I think it's always important to incorporate that in American education because it's already taboo to hear the extremities of African history. So when we're banning any theories that directly relate to us, I think it'll be detrimental to people understanding the Black experience in America. And not only that, it permits that excuse that, oh, well, I didn't know. So you can't be mad at me for not understanding your history. But when you teach it in school, you can hold people more accountable because it's like, well, you learned it 7th through 12th grade, or you learned it in your high school years. You should at least know something. And as of right now, people are still ignorant to like the extensive racism.
Yeah. Let's get one more thought. So, do you agree with Brandon and Tanaya? Do you disagree? I'd like to hear some discourse. Who disagrees with this notion that, or who believes that we're not missing out on much by losing critical race theory in the classroom because it's myopic anyway. There's bigger theories out there. Anybody agree with that statement? Okay, that's fair. Oh, go ahead, Mohammed.
So yeah, I mean, I so it was about the critical race theory being removed from the school, right?
Yes, sir.
So yes, of course. Yeah, I don't know what Brandon said. I didn't hear, but I think yeah, it's gonna be a whole lot of perspective that we're gonna miss out if we skip this theory, because even if we see the other theories where there's the resilience theory and the ecological systems theory, there is a certain aspect of the CRD theory in those theories too, as far as I read, because the resilient theory deals with the struggle and then how you come out of problems. So this is kind of the CRT theory considers this like the racism and the oppression as a problem. So I would say it's gonna affect the way we understand the dynamics of.
By and large, I agree. And just to kind of fill you in, Muhammad, I know you have audio issues. So you're online, you're in alignment, excuse me, with Brandon and Tanaya. All three of you think of this the same. By and large, I agree with the three of you, right? No, Lucia, please do. You don't have to ask, just shout out. This is your class, not mine. I'd rather hear from you.
I would say that personally, if African American history was taught how it was supposed to be taught, in a sense that to like not like in a way hide certain things or like not express the reality of the things that were happening, I feel like everybody in the classroom would be able to fully grasp and understand what is actually going on instead of kind of like in a way walking around eggshells because we're like seeing things and like reading or learning about like African American history, but I feel like it's true in its true form. Like it's more so like sugar coated, or like it's more so like things that are hidden and not things that are supposed to be taught about that have actually happened.
Yeah.
So I feel like if they were being taught in a way that it was truthful and honest, I feel like everybody would be able to have some type of respect, because I feel like if we leave stuff out like that, it's gonna, well, for me at least in my experience with it, I feel like they just kind of like dismiss like a lot of details, like there's so many details out, and I feel like I learned like the complete opposite of what actually is happening, and I didn't get to learn the real and truthfulness about it until college.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct, Lucia. And just from my personal experience, right? So like, I'm trying to think, maybe my when I was first starting my master's, I got into critical. Actually, my bachelor's, I was on critical race theory, but then so my master's, when I got into education, I got into things like culturally responsive pedagogies and things of that nature, and it was like critical race theory and cultural responsive pedagogies were like the most progressive, cutting edge theories of the time. And I forgot who said it, but someone mentioned like this is the only theory to address racism. It's kind of how it was presented, and I fell victim to that as well. Coming up through my educational experiences with Cal State LA, and then I took, in my master's, I took the class that y'all in now, and it introduced me to this particular theory. And for my master's, I did education and Pan-African studies as an interdisciplinary study. And Dr. Bush was was the chair of my committee. He was telling me like, yeah, I mean, the CRT is cool, but it's surface level, right? And we need something that will speak more specifically to our experience, right? Which put me on the path of developing this Pan-African pedagogy, right? But what I think where critical race theory becomes generative and becomes instructive is it's an opening, right? It allows you to walk through the door of being critical and understanding how racism is pervasive in our society, right? And again, by and large, I agree with you all in the fact that this being removed from school is going to have vast negative impacts, because what I heard Lucia was saying implicitly in her conversation was this idea of truth, right? Like, let's fuck all the theory, like put that to the side, right? Let's not even deal with the theory, but let's deal with truth, right? And what this attack on critical race theory is, by and large, right, without hyperbole, it's an attack on the truth. It's an attack on individuals' ability to engage the truth, speak the truth, and critique these fallacies and tropes that have been constructed as truth, right? So I think we're in a very, very dangerous segment of history. How this plays out is going to have vast implications on how we move forward, right? Are we going to be able to move forward, or are we going to regress another 40 years by having things like this removed from the classroom? I'm curious to hear other thoughts about the readings or anything we're discussing. Go ahead.
I agree with you, which is I think too that critical theory should be used in the right way, coming from educators in elementary school or high school or even college, because there's also race in college, like coming from other professor that is not white. So I had a professor that he's anthropology professor, and he was attacking the white people and said that the whole 5 weeks that it was a winter class, so saying that the white people stole our ideas. And so for me it was just attacking people, other races. So and he had a rating. So, and I think not because he's the best professor, but I guess he was just giving the grades. So people rating them because of that. But I just feel like it should be used like in a healthy way too, so we can move forward instead of attacking other races, other cultures. So we have to like watch out how we send the messages to the people who don't know anything about history, like Black history or American history, or any history. So I think it's good to learn it, but we have to use it in a wisely way to how we send the message. So
I think as a whole, I agree with you, right? As a whole, I agree with you. But to the example that you provided, it kind of, I don't know if that example I agree with, right? Because from what I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, the professor was saying that white folks stole some ideas from other cultures, right? And from the history as I understand it, right, that's not inaccurate. If you are to look at westernized philosophy, right, the major philosophers in the Western canon of philosophy, literally, this is not me fabricating, this is like historical evidence. And just so you know, hold on. Just so you don't think I'm making this shit up. George G.M. James wrote this text here, Stolen Legacy, right? And the thesis of this text is that all of your European philosophers had to go to Africa for a minimum of 7 years and learn under the Kemetic mystery system to be considered semi-educated, right? On average, they spent about 20 years, right? So this is where they got their information from. They took this information and they spread it throughout Europe, right? And as it spread throughout Europe, this became the foundation for Western philosophy. They didn't give credit, by and large, to the African people who educated them. So one could argue with this, if what the thesis of this book is true, then yeah, they stole their ideas, right? So for me, critical race theory would be to say that these white folks are stealing African ideas, right? Now, it may not make you feel good, right? But again, kind of going back to what Lucia is saying, if it's the truth, it's the truth. And oftentimes the truth may not be comfortable. And I would posit that the reason that this country is stagnant, does everybody know what I mean when I say stagnant? Does anybody need me to explain stagnation? Right? The reason why this country is stagnant as it pertains to race relations is due to not wanting to make certain people feel uncomfortable, right? And if you listen closely to what the arguments around removing critical race theory from the classroom is, I don't want to make white people feel uncomfortable. This is what they're literally saying in the courts, right? This is their rationale for why this should be removed, right? So to me, I'm not willing to spare someone's feelings so we can continue to promote a false notion of the truth, right? I'm more in line with this idea of fuck your feelings, let's get this truth out, right? And then you could deal with your feelings from a standpoint of truth. Because what's happening now for so long is that their truth has been coddled in false notions, right? Their sense of self has been developed under lies. And we're not going to be able to move forward as a society until we get beyond that. So again, by and large, I agree with what you're saying. It needs to be done in a way that's wise. It's not only what you're doing, but how you're doing it. But if the argumentation is against this claim that white folks stole shit, that's what they did. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what history told, is they stealing shit, right? Like, how do you think the museums are full? Stealing shit, right? Other thoughts? Let's get 2 more before we call it a day. You could volunteer or I could call on people. It's up to y'all. Go ahead, Jake.
I had a question. I looked up the definition on Google, and maybe I just completely missed it when we were talking about today in class, but can you explain to me so I can write it down in my notes of what specifically critical race theory is, and maybe give me an example? I was having trouble understanding.
Yeah, it's really hard to pin down an accurate definition of critical race theory. It's more so. One, you have to understand, like, critical race theory, it came out of the legal discourse, right? So this is a bunch of lawyers getting together, and they wanted to come up with a framework to understand and explain how racism works through all aspects of society, right? So that's one thing. It comes out of this law tradition, and then a lot of sociologists pick up this and kind of bring it into the academy from an academic standpoint. But so I'm going to read just so you can see that I'm being accurate, right? This is the book Critical Race Theory. I'm going to read how they defined it.
Okay.
So it says, what is critical race theory? The critical race theory, CRT movement, is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considered many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourse take up, but places them on a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and feelings of the and even feelings and the unconscious. So they take into account feelings and the unconscious, right? Unlike traditional civil rights, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Right? So this is how they would define critical race theory within the text. Does that help you out, James?
Yes, that gave a much better definition than just looking up on Google. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think to keep in mind, James, like be mindful of the time that you're looking this up, right? So I would argue if you were to do that exercise maybe 2-3 years ago, you probably would have gotten a more concise definition of what critical race theory is. But because it's such a hot button topic right now, right? You get inundated with all kind of things that kind of divert you from the real essence of what this thing is. But I would suggest, do what James is doing and look this shit up, right? Like don't just assume because you're familiar with the term that you have an understanding of what this is, because what's happening and what's majority of the Americans in the southern region of this country are falling victim to are believing something about something they know nothing about, right? They never heard of critical race theory before. They never engaged critical race theory before. But because this became a dog whistle term, everyone knows that it's something negative. They don't even know what it is, right? Because by and large, critical race theory is not even really in K through 12 educational experiences. But they made it a dog whistle term, and now it's being attacked, right? But really, I think I hate that we spent so much time in this conversation around critical race theory, because the point that it brought up within the article is just to say that it's not fully addressing the experiences of African people, right? And we could go beyond what this does and provide a more comprehensive approach to understanding life experiences of African people. Also, I want you guys to be attentive to how they take models and theories that are already in place and expand upon them, right? They took ecological systems theory and they added on another element to it, and they made it more specified to the experiences of African people. If you listen closely to the reading, they're inviting you all as scholars to take this African American male theory and expand upon it, just like they're expanding upon ecological systems theory and they're critiquing critical race theory, right? So this is really the work of intellectual production, right? This is the reason why you read all these texts as you prepare for your dissertation, is so you can familiarize yourself with these theories, you can critique these theories, and you can build upon these theories, right? This is the work that intellectuals do. And this reading provides a premier example of how to do that work. And I don't want that to get lost in the conversation also. You can literally read this as instructions on how to do intellectual work, right? And I would encourage you guys to go back and read it, not for what, right? Not for what's being said, but for how. How are they saying what they're saying? How are they doing the work to get to these points, right? And this is something that you guys should start evolving your reading into, right? Not just reading for the what, but reading for the how, because the how is often more useful. Because if you think about it, you may not always agree with what's being said. That might not work for your research, but how they say it could be useful for your personal research. And as intellectuals and as scholars, you need to start thinking about the how and putting more emphasis on the how than you do on the what. Are there any